Welcome back, and thank you for joining me again in Bible study. This is our second session on Joel chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, and 28 and 29. If you didn't complete the first session, and you'd like to, there's a link that's going to pop up, and it can take you to that first session. However, you don't need to complete the first session to participate in the second one. Each session is self-contained, and you can carry on from here if you wish. If you want to read the text again, down in the video details, there are 2 links to today's reading, one for each section of it. You can pause the video, this video here, and then come back after you've read it. If you don't have time to read the reading, that's okay. I'll give you a quick summary. In the first 2 verses, God invites God's people to have a change of heart. In the second 2 verses, the blessing of God's Spirit is given to everyone. It's that second half of the reading that I want to concentrate on for a moment. We hear that certain people are going to receive the blessing of God's Spirit, sons and daughters, old men, young men, male and female slaves. I'd like that list to be different if it were written today. I'd like it to be old men and old women, and young men and young women, and to include people who don't identify in either of those 2 genders. I'd like it not to have slaves in there as a reference because I don't believe that slavery is good. However, this is an ancient text that we have, and we work with what we have. As I thought about how we could look at these classifications, I thought that maybe sons and daughters could represent the future, and old men could represent the past, and young men could represent the present, and male and female slaves could represent those who have no status. Again, I wish the list were different, but it is what we have. I do think, though, that for biblical times, this was a fairly comprehensive list. It, I think, means to tell us that there is no one who is outside of the reach of the blessing of God's Spirit. And it leads us to our first question for today. Who isn't included when we think of people who have been blessed by God? Maybe there are people of a different faith tradition or different ethnic background, or people who we view as living contrary to what we think of as God's will. Maybe there are people we just don't agree with, or people who have hurt us, who we think maybe are not blessed by God. So I encourage you to take a moment, pause the video, and reflect on how we talk about God's blessing. And if the language that we use excludes anyone, who isn't included when we think of people who have been blessed by God. Now, outside of this reading that we have, we hear that the big issue for Joel is the infestation of locusts that devour the land. And Joel doesn't seem to be concerned about trying to pin the cause of that infestation on God or on the faithlessness of God's people, which are typical ways of expressing it in the scriptures. Instead, Joel calls God's people to weep for the devastation of the land itself. This from Feasting on the Word. The penitents in Joel weep for the land's suffering rather than for themselves or their guilty past. Now, certainly we're connected to the land. And if the land is destroyed and there's no crops, we don't have food. However, the penitents in Joel weep not for the lack of food that they would have, but for the suffering for the land. I've wept, and I think we've all wept for the suffering of people other than ourselves. And our deepest weeping is for the people that we have the deepest connection to. Which leads us to our second question. How connected do you feel to the land? If land was destroyed, would you weep for the destruction of the land itself and not for lack of food? How strong would your connection to the land have to be in order to weep for it? Who are some of God's people who you think would weep for the land? I encourage you to take a moment now and pause the video and reflect on how connected you are to the land. I noted at the beginning of this series of videos that the readings for the 4 weeks of Advent are grouped into a season of hope. And each week we will end with this question. How does this story give us hope? Once you've had time to think about these questions, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you didn't catch the questions when they were displayed on the screen, don't worry. They're also in the details that are posted with this video. Please let me know what you think, and I hope that you'll join me again in a couple of days for more Bible study.